I know you have been searching the internet high and low for a video that'll actually show you how to win your fantasy basketball playoffs. And I'm not just talking about schedule grids or, information that is public knowledge that your opponents also have readily available to them. No. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to win your league using the secret sauce. Welcome to the Game Pick Fantasy Basketball Podcast. I am your host, Robin Marks. You can connect with me on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Game Pick Podcast. If you love ESPN and Yahoo Points Leagues, Category Leagues, Dynasty, and Sleeper's new Game Pick format, please consider subscribing on all channels. And please stick around until the end because I'm going to share the most important tip to winning your fantasy championship. Now, let's jump into the meat and potatoes. For me, I used to really draft my team with the playoffs in mind. I used to draft my team with the playoffs in mind. So I would get the schedule grid from ESPN, from Basketball Monster, from hashtag basketball, all of these schedule grids. I would look at, what week my playoffs were starting in, what players had the most games, and I would build my draft around that. Excuse me. And part of my voice, guys, I am a little scratchy today. Now, mind you, I built my entire team around what was going to happen in March and, in April, really, like the end of the fantasy season. So I was planning for March. But what happened was, although I did have some success, I'm not going to say that it doesn't work because it does work based on the kind of, competition you're facing. You might have some guys who are not going to be as diligent as you are and won't look into the details like you are. But if you're playing in a competitive league, everyone has the same information you have. It is readily available and accessible for your opponents the same way it's available and accessible to you. So what happened was I was drafting way ahead, but things like injuries happened, things like players getting rested happened, things like players not playing in back-to-backs, and then even trades occurred. So you might have drafted, let's say, a person like Tyrese Halliburton and leaning into the Sacramento Kings schedule, but he gets traded to the Pacers, and now he has an Indiana Pacers schedule. So what I want to just teach you today is that you don't need to look so far ahead that you paralyze yourself from actually being nimble and being able to adjust on the fly in order to win your championship. Okay. So the first important tip, you have to stream. If you don't know what streaming is, basically it's taking the worst 1 to 3 players on the bottom of your roster and cycling them out for other players who play games at opportune times or play more games. So if you're not doing the streaming strategy, you're going to miss out on some opportunities. So you have to stream and, most importantly, maximize your roster spots. Look at your roster spots as the opportunity to put as many players in for those amount of days as possible. And also, if you look at it as slots more than players, a player who has, let's say, 3 games in a week will probably be, just as valuable as keeping somebody on your roster who has those 3 games, depending on when those games are happening. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, in terms of like games that are valuable games and how to figure out where those are happening or when they're happening. So yes, you can use a schedule grid to figure that out. So I'm not against schedule grids, and I don't want to come across like that because I utilize schedule grids quite often, and I have for years. But I don't want us to be crippled by the schedule grid. Don't think that that's the only way it has to be, because the fact of the matter is, it really depends on what happens with your roster. Although, let's say the Cleveland Cavaliers have a really good they have a really good playoff schedule. If you didn't draft any Cleveland Cavalier players, or you're not able to get any in a draft, there are only so many streaming options for the Cleveland Cavaliers. So like, you have to play your roster, play your hand, and make the best of it. So another thing I want to address in terms of maximizing roster spots is, a strategy that I use every year. What I want you to do right now is go into your app, whether it's Yahoo, if you're in ESPN, whatever format you use, go to your league right now, go to the schedule, right? In your app, you can find your playoff schedule and your regular season schedule, toggle to your playoff schedule, and look at the dates. Once you realize what the dates are, go back to your actual roster, and here's the ninja trick. Here's the secret sauce. Set your lineups for the playoffs. Yes, I know what you're thinking. That's like 2 months away. That's depending on whenever you're watching this. And also, I'll add, this video will be good for any season that you do fantasy basketball. This will work for category formats. This will work for points formats. Get out your phone and set your lineups for the playoffs right now. Now, what I want you to do is look at the high volume days. So for example, you're going to have a Wednesday or a Thursday where the NBA has 13 games, 12 games, and some of your players are not going to be able to play because you have too many players and not enough spots in the active roster spots. So you're going to have to leave people on the bench. You're going to have to leave points on the bench unless you think ahead, right? So now that we've taken the opportunity to set our lineup, we know what our lineup is going to look like for week 1 of the playoffs. We know what our lineup is going to look like for week 2 of the playoffs. And if we're lucky enough to make it to the finals, we also know what our lineup will look like in the finals, right? So now that you have that information, you want to add valuable players to your roster. Now, if you're in the playoff hunt and you're trying to make the playoffs, I'm not getting so caught up in this. I'm not like, oh, let me start thinking about the playoffs, even though I'm, two spots out of having a playoff spot. Nah, you focus on your season. But as you get closer to the fantasy playoffs and you're going to make the fantasy playoffs, what I'm going to say is, once you know you're going to make it to the fantasy playoffs, the week before, ninja trick, secret sauce, the week before, doesn't matter if you're losing, winning, whatever it is, because if you know you have a playoff spot, unless you're sacrificing a bye, like if you have the first, if you're the number 1 seed and in your playoff structure, you have buys put into place, then this wouldn't apply. I wouldn't go, skunking up the last week of the regular season. But if you know you have a playoff spot, it doesn't matter who you play. You don't fear any teams because we'll beat anybody, right? What I want you to do is start picking up players now that will fill those slots for next week without having to use any of your weekly acquisitions. Now, this doesn't count for people who have unlimited weekly acquisitions, which is like crazy anyway. If you have a league, don't have unlimited waiver acquisitions. Oh, hell no. It's just dumb. It takes away from the fun of the game. So please don't do it. Like, that's just craziness. It's just going to be like the wild, wild west. So don't do it. Oh, hell no. For real. I'm just saying. So now that we are adding players for the first week of the playoffs, last week of the season, you're trying to grab players and not use your acquisitions. Also, another ninja tip, look for players that have the back-to-backs, especially if those back-to-backs fall on those high quality games. And again, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Okay. So the next tip I have for you is when you are in war, don't be afraid to sacrifice for the greater good of the team. And what does that mean? That's basically talking about dropping people, right? When you get into the heat of the battle, like you are going to have to find spots to stream players. You cannot make it through and win a championship against competent fantasy players if you don't play the streaming game. And in order to do that, you're going to have to let some people go. What happened? What happened to that boy? I'm just saying, it's like something that is a part of the game. And the sooner we get with the program, the better off we'll be. You know what I'm saying? So that's the number 2 tip is when you're in war, don't be afraid to sacrifice. You're going to have to drop some good people. What happened to that boy? Okay. So another tip, once the playoffs start, focus on the week in front of you. Once the playoffs start, focus on the week in front of you. So sometimes when we're in the playoffs, we're using that same strategy from the last week of the regular season where, let me see if I can snatch a couple players without using my acquisitions for next week. I have a couple, I'm up by 50 points. I'm up by 100 points. Fantasy basketball, unlike fantasy football, can turn around really quick. So you could be up by 100 points one night and you'll wake up and you'll be down by 200. It's just facts. So unless you're going to win, right? So like if it's the Saturday or Sunday night and you're up by 700 points and you have more players than that person, or they're not really active, they're not streaming, they didn't use any of their acquisitions, and you're going to win. All right, I'm not mad at that. If you need to make that move to pick up some people, no problem. However, if you're in a match where you're up by 100 points or down by a couple of points, what you need to do is do what you have to do to win that week. That includes dropping as many players as you need to fill those slots with players who are going to be performing, for high quality games. And that's just a fact of life. Now, some leagues have the undroppable lists, which would prevent you from dropping like a Giannis Antetokounmpo or Luka Doncic, something like that. I get that. I'm not saying drop those guys. I'm talking about your mid-round guys. If you got to drop Darius Garland, even if you got to drop a Darius Garland to get that spot filled, then you got to do it. That would be like a serious last resort and back against the wall, and your commissioner might get mad. But you have to do what you have to do, especially in a redraft league, because these players, it doesn't matter if you drop the player now, because if you don't win, you're out. You lose. You don't get to play the next week. So it doesn't matter. Dynasty, a whole different ball game. And if you guys want a playoff strategy video for Dynasty specifically, please let me know in the comments. Okay. So I promised to share the most important tip to win your fantasy playoffs. But before I do, I want to tell you about Underdog Fantasy. Underdog is the best place to play fantasy sports, including best ball, daily drafts, and pick'em. Start drafting in minutes for a shot at big cash and an enhanced game watching experience. Once I heard about those cosigns from Kevin Durant and Mark Cuban, I knew I had to spread the news. Sign up today and use the code GamePickPodcast, and Underdog will match your first deposit up to $100. It's like getting free money. Don't miss out on your chance to double up from the jump. To sign up, just download the Underdog Fantasy app on Android or iOS. Now, the most important tip, it's not about how many games players have, it's about the quality of the games. So, like I said earlier, you might have to bench some players if you have too many players playing. So what you want to do is when you set those lineups, like I told you to do, set your lineups for your fantasy playoffs all 3 weeks and look at them. Once you can identify which teams and which players are playing on those high quality days, the days where there are not so many games, you know what I'm saying? So let's say there are only 4 NBA games on one night, and then the next night they're like 13 games. You want to get people on the night where there are not so many games. So the ninja trick is when you're picking up those players, those are the players that you want to target. So if you're drafting at the beginning of the season, looking for players who are going to be in the fantasy playoffs with a bunch of games, but they're playing low quality games, it does not help you. So the trick is you want to find players who are playing during those quality games. Do me a favor, drop a comment and let me know what the most helpful tip was that I shared with you today. And if you want a surefire way to win your league year after year, if you want to crush your league, please join our free Game Pick Discord server. We give trade advice. We have league finders, team names, the works. All you have to do is visit taplink.cc/game pick podcast. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, share with a friend, hit us with a thumbs up, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you absolutely crush it this week. Now get out there and make some game picks.